So, I would like to speak with you about how Americans are being manipulated into compliance. If I can be frank, I'd like to speak with you about how you're being played. You see, there's powerful interests that prefer that our protests stay narrow, symbolic, and controllable. The propaganda machine is behind most nonviolent protest. The elites, they often try to channel, soften, and manage nonviolent movements so that they don't seriously threaten their power. Elites like limited, safe, non-violent protest. Non-violent resistance can be very powerful when it's the masses out there, when it's sustained, when it's disruptive. That's when our power actually works. So what they've done is said, to protect our interests, we need to push this non-violent, peaceful protest. Large movements, general strikes, coordinated non-compliance have historically been more effective than violent uprisings. Now, that part is true. States fear serious nonviolent resistance, and sometimes they infiltrate movements to push them toward violence so that they can justify harsh crackdowns. We all knew this. When we see protesters, they're peaceful, and then people that are not part of the protests show up and they start vandalizing and rioting so that they can say, look at all of these protesters, they're nothing but extremists or radicals. Did you know that foundations and big donors often defang movements? That's movements with teeth. Think of the movements that we've had in the past. They were sustained. Think about Malcolm X. Think about MLK. Think about the women's movement. Those things weren't just 2 marches. They were consistent. Think of the labor movements. Research shows that philanthropy and social movements have a long history of funding activism in ways that redirect it into safer, less radical channels, away from structural challenges like corporate power or policing. And it's more towards narrower, more symbolic goals. See, this isn't usually marketed as control, but the effect is that the movement becomes more professionalized. It's more grant dependent, and they're less willing to use disruptive tactics that would upset donors. So there's a real pattern here where moneyed interests are comfortable with certain kinds of non-violent protests. And those certain non-violent protests are short permitted marches, hashtags, campaigns, awareness days, because those don't stop profits or governance. And they can even serve as pressure release valves, where you walk away feeling like you've done something. You've released that pressure that you felt by marching for one day. So the propaganda around nonviolence what it aims to do is to define the boundaries of acceptable resistance. Media, billionaire-owned media, and political elites often praise peaceful protests while condemning any serious disruptions, strikes, blockades, boycotts that bite. Think of all the students that were on campuses recently and how they labeled them as extremists or radicals. We have a history of students on campus protesting, and now all of a sudden they're radical extremists. And that's a perfect example in which states sent in people to infiltrate these movements and push towards violence so that they can justify harsh crackdowns. It wasn't the students that were violent. It was the people that were sent there. They encourage these one-off spectacles instead of long campaigns. They know that sporadic marches alone rarely shift power. It's the sustained, organized, non-cooperation, especially targeting economic and institutional pillars of support that forces change. When protest is reduced to occasional rallies, it becomes easy for regimes and corporations to ignore. They're the very ones that are promoting the idea that good citizens protest but don't disrupt. And that narrative keeps people calm, in a sense. And they feel that they've done something by attending a march, but nothing in the system's day-to-day operations is actually threatened. So as long as nothing affects their interests, as long as nothing truly affects their interests, as long as the profits keep coming in, capital's flows, and states' functions are undisruptive, they can keep extracting wealth and ravaging our resources because we're so compliant. Because we're too busy listening to the media instead of using classical tactics that we've always used in the past to force change. Nonviolent action in itself is not the problem. It's disciplined nonviolent campaigns that target economic and institutional pillars, business elites, security forces, bureaucracy. Those things are actually more effective in some ways than violent campaigns, though both have succeeded and produced better long-term outcomes. The problem is when it's fragmented. These protests, they're infrequent. They're purely symbolic protests. That's what we saw with the last protest. And there's over-reliance on NGOs and foundations that really soften people's demands. Movements that stop at marches instead of building real leverage like strikes, boycotts. The way that we have our 8-hour days, our 5-day work week, that wasn't two sporadic strikes. Those were unions. These were people that said that we're not going to cross the line and we're not going to let anybody cross the line. Those people, they weren't at work. They walked off their jobs. Something that people fear doing right now. People fear everything right now because they're so busy listening to billionaires. one-day rallies, social media virtue signaling, and asking nicely, that's propaganda. And it's not going to get us anywhere. And it's all framed as legitimate protests if we are really not pushing back. And it's illegitimate if we use nonviolent tactics. And again, general strikes, consumer boycotts. Right now, it's let's do an economic blackout for just a few days. What's a few days supposed to do? And people say, oh, well, we don't want people to lose their jobs if we do an economic blackout for any period of time. Well, people are getting laid off from their jobs regardless of what we do. This one-day march, let's stick our heads in the sand. Let's just wait 4 years. Let's wait for the politicians to do the right thing. None of those things is working. Complacency is not working. We need to do something that is effective. And one of those things is relying on classic tactics that we've used in the past. And it is also not listening to billionaire-owned media. Think about your situation. Think of other people's situation. Think of how every single day we are hearing and watching blatant corruption. We're watching a thug that was installed against the will of the people, hardening criminals, high-profile criminals. He's selling everything, including the White House. The list of things that is going on right now is too numerous to name. But we cannot keep going this way. We must be willing to fight back by all means necessary.